I'm Brigid Prial, and today my talk is called Our Closest Cousins, Laboratory Chimpanzees in HIV/AIDS Research and Historicizing Compassion. So every day, each of us make decisions about animals. We think about whether we eat them or not. We decide which ones are welcome in our homes, and we might seek them out in our recreation or leisure time. So some of us might think really deeply about the ethics of making these decisions, and others of us may not. But in either case, our feelings about animals are a product of history. I think this might sound surprising initially if we think of history as sort of a specific realm of studying war, economics, power. So when we think about things that seem personal and natural, like feelings, especially about animals, we tend to think of those things as outside of history. But in this talk, I'll be discussing a very charismatic animal, the chimpanzee, that has provoked a lot of feelings, and the ways that our understanding of human difference shapes our feelings about animals. If you're skeptical about how compassion for animals, shapes history, I'll also, through the case of HIV/AIDS, talk about how strong sentiments about human and animal difference shaped, real material change, like in the federal response to the AIDS epidemic, and made permanent change in U.S. biomedical research. So chimps had been lab animals in the US for about 60 years before the emergence of HIV. And during this time, lab chimpanzee research was mostly unremarkable to the American public. It didn't seem particularly morally troubling. For example, this is an image of a lab chimp experiment that was high stakes and dangerous in 1961, but the Life magazine article and other media representations of the flight of Ham, the space chimp, into orbit portray this as sort of a stunning Cold War scientific achievement rather than something that's an ethical dilemma. So other media portrayals, the culture of the space race, these shaped Americans' response to the experiment of Ham the chimpanzee into orbit as one of patriotic celebration and not a bioethical dilemma. This is not the case for chimp experimentation during AIDS, which shows not only how our cultural feelings about animals change over time, but how ideas about human difference critically shape our feelings about animals. So in 1984, infectious disease researchers infected chimps with AIDS for the first time, or the HIV virus. And viruses like HIV are very specific to species, so when chimps began to show an immune response to HIV, the federal government funneled AIDS funding into chimpanzee laboratory research. For example, this image comes from the National Chimpanzee Breeding Program that utilized funding for AIDS research to breed chimps for HIV research. Because of the media attention on what was in the early 80s a lethal and mysterious disease, chimps' involvement in AIDS research was covered widely in the press, like you can see here. AIDS activism also brought more public attention to chimp experimentation. AIDS activists were vocal, passionate, and organized. They drew public and government attention to the pressing issues of people with AIDS that they believed weren't getting adequate attention. In the 1970s and 1980s, genetic research had produced statistics that you've probably heard, that chimpanzees are 98% genetically similar to humans. And this statistic was repeated over and over in animal rights advocacy literature against chimp AIDS experimentation. This idea that chimpanzees are humanity's closest cousin and that they don't deserve to be infected with HIV. So the director of the National Anti-Vivisection Society wrote in a newsletter, quote, "Why should anyone applaud the infliction of such a dire disease on our nearest genetic cousin, an endangered species which shares 98.6% of our DNA, especially when there are many humans afflicted with AIDS who are eager to serve as guinea pigs for further research?" Aside from humane societies, throughout the country, constituents wrote letters to their congressional representatives to share their opposition to using chimps for AIDS research. This one states, "Chimps should not have to pay for human social problems." And another citizen wrote to his congressman here that an induced disease, meaning induced in a laboratory, is totally different than one that evolves by improper living habits. AIDS principally affects gay men and those into the misuse of drugs. So these are mainstream stereotypes of AIDS as a disease of promiscuous gay men or intravenous drug users that fueled Americans' dislike for the experimental use of chimpanzees. In previous decades, chimps were used in other infectious disease research, harmful psychological research, research that didn't have many direct applications to human society. But in the strong reactions against chimpanzee HIV experimentation, we can see the blame and apathy for people with AIDS. In the late 1990s, vehement public disagreement with chimps in these kinds of experiments led to the federal government shutting down chimpanzee AIDS research. So retiring HIV-infected chimps from labs was a logistical challenge, and in 2000, the Chimp Act designated sanctuaries for former lab chimps to retire to. In the passage of this act, some congresspeople questioned providing chimps with governmental support that a lot of humans didn't have. So Sherrod Brown of Ohio said, providing chimpanzees with housing in a protected environment that is sensitive to their social needs, along with long-term health care and medications, is all well and good for the chimps. However, America's human citizens also deserve these benefits. It's time for this Congress to examine the public health policies that it's legislating for animals, right, and to use them as models for caring for our most valued resource, America's human citizens. Right, so Brown is pointing out that housing and essentially universal health care are being offered to former lab chimps when people across the country lack these, and that these things are in fact were part of the reason for the devastation of the AIDS epidemic. So during the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the US, the idea of chimpanzees as humanity's closest cousins was a powerful argument for the protection of chimps from experimentally induced AIDS. Being almost human or genetic cousins was the rhetorical basis for why chimps should be afforded some kinds of care. But through this case of HIV/AIDS, we can also see how the category of humanity does not necessarily extend that same protection to everyone in it. As clear in the public response to chimp experimentation, not all human beings are considered morally equal, especially given drug user status or sexual difference. These made some people seem guilty of their disease, while chimpanzees seemed innocent. So I hope that this talk has offered a basis for recognizing zero-sum arguments that pit human and animal welfare against each other, and also help ensure that our efforts in the future to be compassionate towards animals do not come at the expense of already marginalized human beings. Thank you.